Sir, my team of systems engineers was tasked with briefing you on probable solutions to the refugee problem that exists throughout the Middle East and Europe. The team consists of myself, Cadet Pierce Ippolito, and Cadets Matt Sinella and Will Wisnett. Before introducing the proposed solutions, it is imperative to define the problem and the stakeholders who are most important to the refugee problem. By using the distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives model, also known as DSRP, from Derek and Laura Cabrera's book, Systems Thinking Made Simple, we were able to make quality distinctions, identify multiple systems within refugee camps, identify relationships between the discovered systems, and, like all systems engineers, approach the problem from multiple perspectives. The first distinctions we made involved the multiple stakeholders: refugees, radical groups, host nations, countries of origin, EUCOM, and NGOs. From these distinct stakeholders, we next looked at what intertwined systems were involved in refugee camps. We came to the conclusion that a refugee camp is a system in itself, with moving cogs that are a part of a greater whole. Next, we identified relationships that exist. From our analysis, our group identified 3 relationships that are most important. The first being the relationship between the actual camp and the refugees. The refugees provide the camp with a labor force, and the camp provides the refugees with housing. The second relationship is that between the refugees and the radical groups that recruit them. This is a relationship of interest because our main objective is to reduce refugee radicalization. The last relationship of interest is the relationship between the refugees and host countries, as host countries provide a large amount of the funding used to keep the refugees safe and employed. Finally, the refugees provide the host country with an increased labor force, which can drive the country's economy. After laying out the relationships that exist within refugee radicalization, we approach this wicked problem using the point of view of all of the stakeholders involved, as each has different values that are important to them. We use the stakeholders' values to define the most important overarching objectives while considering the importance of each stakeholder. Our effective needs statement says that EUCOM needs to leverage NATO resources to improve the infrastructure in order to improve quality of life for the refugees, which will decrease the risk for refugee radicalization. Based on the effective needs statement, we came up with the following candidate solutions. For those candidate solutions, we came up with the following 6 constraints. For those constraints, this is the baseline where we are currently standing. We would be willing to risk these maximums for those constraints. Ideally, we would like to minimize the cost, get to 100 on a scale of 0 to 100 for safety risk, 0 on refugee radicalization threshold, 0 stress on European economies, and we would like to meet 100% of General Scaparotti's and refugees.
For course of action 1, building schools and developing education systems, we determined this system costs about $5 billion, poses a low safety risk, and would lower the refugee radicalization to below the threshold of 2%. And this would only have a stress for European economies of 90 on the scale that we developed from 1 to 100, and would meet General Scaparotti's needs of 70, also on the scale of 1 to 100, and completely meet the refugees' needs.
Our first proposed solution is to build schools and educational programs for the refugees. Attending school will occupy a large portion of refugee children's time, keeping them out of trouble and qualify them for jobs in the future. This course of action will reduce the risk of refugee radicalization by integrating the refugees with Europeans and by educating the refugees. The initial cost of this course of action will be high, but the subsequent cost will lower after the initial construction and implementation to simply maintenance fees and salaries for the teachers.
For course of action 2, improving the infrastructure of the camps, we determined the system would cost about $7 billion, also have a low safety risk, and lower the threshold for refugee radicalization to below 2%, while only putting a stress of 80 on the European economies, meeting General Scaparotti's needs with an 80, and meeting the refugees' needs with a 90.
The next proposed solution is to improve the infrastructure of the refugee camps to create more permanent communities. The buildings in the camps will be transformed from temporary settlements to more lasting community-based housing. This course of action will have significant costs during the development stage, because it will require building multiple buildings and roads. But after the initial construction phase, the cost should be minimal. By providing the refugees with a more permanent community, refugees will be encouraged to take ownership of their new homes, communities, and lives. This course of action will reduce the potential for refugee radicalization by inculcating the refugees into their new communities through their newly constructed homes within their host countries.
For course of action 3, a loose vetting path to citizenship, this would roughly cost about $150 US. The safety risk would be high. The refugee radicalization threshold would be higher at 5%, meaning that 5% of the current population we expect to radicalize. This would put a lot of stress on the European economies, and this would most likely not meet much of General Scaparotti's needs, but would meet most of the refugee needs as we gave it a scale of 90. The next proposed course of action is the development of an improved immigration vetting system. This system will be able to differentiate between those refugees with a high potential for radicalization and those who have a low potential for radicalization. This course of action aims to continue to allow refugees into Europe while simultaneously reducing the risk of radicalization by identifying the refugees with a high potential and thus denying them entry. This course of action will be relatively inexpensive as it will only require the upgrade of current immigration control measures and an increase in the border security force. For course of action 5, which would improve the view of the refugees to the current population, we estimate that this would be a cost of $250 million US, which would just break our threshold. This would be a low-medium risk of security. This would lower the current refugee rate to 1.5%. It would increase the stress on European economies, but would still be okay with the score of 60. This would meet about 60% of General Scaparotti's security needs and would meet about 60% of the refugees' needs. Our next proposed course of action is to leverage the host nation's governments and media outlets to influence the popular opinion of the refugees in the eyes of the European natives. According to Joey Millar of Express News, over 2/3 of Europeans currently have a negative opinion of the refugees. This fosters bad feelings between both groups. Our system seeks to improve the view that both groups hold of each other and dispel any negative prejudices. Dispelling these negative prejudices will help reduce the potential for radicalization amongst the refugees. This course of action will not be very expensive because it will not require building anything, just the creation of propaganda. For course of action 4, which would be a strict path to citizenship and deportation, we estimate that this would be an increased cost of $225 billion, but the safety risk would be very low. Radicalization would be lower to about a 0.5% per population. The stress on the European economies would be much lower at 30. This would meet most of General Scaparotti's needs, but this would hardly meet any of the refugee needs.
Our last proposed course of action is the implementation of strict immigration laws and the deportation of all refugees currently in Europe. By deporting refugees, the needs of many host nations could be addressed, including freeing up jobs for European citizens and eliminating the financial burden that the refugees have created. This course of action will also greatly increase the physical safety of the host countries. But with this course of action, some problems arise. Deporting refugees is not a viable option to some of our stakeholders, so the system fails to meet their needs. Mass deportation could also potentially lead to an increase in refugee radicalization after the refugees have been deported, leading to further problems in the future. This course of action would also be expensive, as deporting all the refugees would require a lot of time and resources.
In conclusion, after analyzing this wicked problem, our team has proposed 5 solutions that improve upon the current situation. General Scaparotti, sir, these potential solutions have been created in accordance with our stakeholders' values. We are now open to any questions, comments, or concerns. This now concludes our brief.